Welcome to a replay of one of our many excellent talks from Secure Southwest 15, and thanks again to our sponsors Securious, C3IA, CrowdStrike and the British Computer Society, and most importantly our prime sponsor, the UK Government Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport.
So this afternoon's final session, ahead of me wrapping up as close to 16:25 as I can, keeping it to 5 minutes. We've got Chloe from the University of Plymouth Marine Threats Research Group going to give us an overview of what the global leading work of the Cyber Ship Lab is doing. And as fascinating as it's been as I've tracked that through. Then Zeki from CrowdStrike is going to talk about how automation is changing the face of skills needs in our domain. And finally, Akim from the University of Exeter is going to outline the link between digital security and privacy by design and the skills needs associated with that. So without further ado, Chloe, the floor is yours.
Clicker is working now, so I'm going to give it a go. We'll see how far we get. So thank you. I'm here. Well, I've come up from the office down at the bottom of campus because I work here to just tell you a little bit about something that we think is really exciting that's going on here at the university, specifically focused on maritime cybersecurity, but cybersecurity nonetheless, just to give you an idea of a sort of alternative path that your cybersecurity career could take potentially, and tell you a bit about what we're doing here. So I'm the project and knowledge exchange manager for what we are calling the Cyber Ship Lab. And you have to enunciate that very carefully. I've done presentations recently where I've tried to rush through that and people have looked at me and said, the what, Chloe? So I'm going to try and say it very carefully. Now I'm going to try the clicker. Still not going. Next slide, please. There we go. So maritime cyber is a bit of an interesting one. The sort of tagline that we've been using is that it's uniquely valuable, but also uniquely vulnerable. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Traditionally, there has been this perception in maritime that, you know, if you're on the ocean in the middle of the ocean on a vessel, you're not connected to any network, and therefore you're not vulnerable at all to a cyber attack. Historically, that might have been correct, but that's not the case now. You know, everything and everyone actually is connected to the internet really all the time via all your wearable technology, your watch, your phone. Everything is transmitting data all the time via satellite. But unfortunately, that historical perception has meant that the maritime sector is somewhat behind the curve, I think it's fair to say, in terms of addressing the cybersecurity problems that affect it. If you compare it, for example, to the automotive sector or the aerospace industry, we are quite some way behind. And we are hoping to help the sector address that gap, really plug that gap. The other reason that maritime sort of is more vulnerable, I think, to cyber attacks at the moment is that, again, if you think about cars and aeroplanes, ships by comparison are actually built to last quite a lot longer. I think the average lifespan of a vessel is about 25 to 30 years. So what that means in reality is that you have these vessels that are operating legacy equipment that has been kind of patched on a really ad hoc, quite random basis over quite a long period of time. And so literally every vessel on the sea has a potentially slightly different set of cyber vulnerabilities because it will have been interacted with slightly differently over time. They may well have started identically, but that isn't how they end up. So those two reasons combined are why the maritime sector is actually uniquely vulnerable, particularly now, to cyber attack. Next slide, please. So maritime cyber attacks in general, I read a statistic recently that said that in the last 3 years, maritime cyber attacks had increased something like 900%. So it's a problem. It's a problem that needs addressing, and it's a problem that people on both sides of the fence are fully aware of. and some people are exploiting, obviously, to their advantage at the moment. The UK is, as an island nation, is actually particularly vulnerable. The statistic on the slide there says 90% of world trade is moved by ship, but that actually goes up to 96%, I think, for the UK. And we've done some kind of modelling within our research that shows that which is quite possible, 3 of the major UK ports happened to be affected by a cyber attack at the same time, it would take, you could count the number of days on one hand before really the country would come to its knees in terms of the effect there would be on supply chains and particularly fuel deliveries. So it's a really important area. Next slide, please. So given all what I've just said, the university have this Maritime Cyber Threats Research Group, which is looking into exactly these problems. Now, this group is actually the biggest of its kind globally. It's a really kind of multidisciplinary group. So, of course, we house the cybersecurity experts and the navigation experts, of course we do, but more than that, wider than that, we include people like historians and psychologists as well, because we feel that they can really allow us to approach the problems holistically and then provide and feed back to the sector really realistic mitigation research and ideas and really to have a kind of tangible impact. I mentioned particularly historians and psychologists, and I'll just give you a couple of examples as to why. Reason being, of course, that people are the main vulnerability in terms of cybersecurity, which I don't think is new news. I think we know that. But they're also the kind of quickest and easiest way often of mitigating against cyber attacks. And so a lot of what we do is focusing on the type of training that we might be able to deliver in order to up the security of the sector in general in the most effective way. If you think historically, piracy has always been a thing. It's just manifested itself in different ways over time. But one of the reasons that we're really proud actually to include the historians in our cyber threats research group is because if you think about historical wrecking, for example, where a beacon would be lit on top of a cliff in the wrong place to lure a ship onto some rocks, it would founder, people would recover the cargo and sell it obviously for their own profit. Well, of course, this kind of thing still happens. It's just that there's no beacon now, there's no flames, it's all on a screen. Someone's spoofing something on your radar or your ECTIS or some of your ship's bridge systems. But interestingly, a lot of the drivers behind this kind of crime and a lot of the lessons that can be learned from history, they map over into today. So that's the reason that we involve the historians. We can learn some interesting lessons and not reinvent the wheel because there are people who can advise us outside the kind of standard cybersecurity sort of set of skills that we can really utilize. Same kind of thing for the psychologists. Going back to what I said about a lot of our focus being on the training, obviously what we do, and I'll explain a little bit more as I go on, in the Cyber Ship Lab is we take a lot of our tangible research outputs and we use them in our ship's bridge. We have a immersive ship's bridge simulator here at the university. We use them for training future navigators and future crews about how to deal with cyber attacks and how to recognise them particularly. And one of the ways that you might be made aware on a vessel of a cyber attack is via some sort of alarm being triggered. Often that alarm takes the form of a kind of beeping noise or whatever, we're all familiar with them. But there's a lot of interesting psychology or psychological research that's gone on behind the scenes, particularly on our cyber threats research group, to show that sometimes actually these alarms, they're not only not effective, but they're actually counterproductive, because if you imagine yourself in a kind of crisis scenario, in an emergency on a ship's bridge, and you've got a beeping alarm going in your ear, it might be the thing that tips you over the edge actually. And so there's some interesting input that we get from the psychologists around how those alarms could be much better tailored to only reach certain people, for example. There might be different sounds, they might not be sound at all, they might be light. They might take the form actually of, I don't know, a text message to particular people's phones. So that's why we involve all those different types of people in our research, because it really does add to what we do in ways that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily expect on the face of it. Next slide, please. So moving on then to the actual Cybership lab itself, because I can hear you all wondering what on earth it is that I'm talking about. It's a hardware-based platform where the idea is that we can cyber risk assess any ship's bridge. It's sponsored by Research England in its initial phase of 4 years to the tune of just over £3 million. And it's a three-way partnership really between government via Research England, academia via ourselves, and of course industry, the sector itself. And industry, I'll mention a bit more about this later, but they're absolutely crucial in that kind of triple helix, because without their input, we don't understand what the problems actually are that need addressing. We focused down on the ship's bridge because, of course, we need to start somewhere, and that seemed like the obvious point. But I will say that it's not just the ship's bridge system of systems that we're looking at all. We understand that once you're into that system, it's quite easy to hop around if you know what you're doing to affect other systems. So, for example, the rudder system, the propulsion system, the ballast system even. But wider than that, thinking, kind of wider than just the vessel itself, of course, as everything becomes smarter and more digitized, the ships interact with the ports. Ports themselves are becoming smarter. All of the equipment is automated. And a lot of the vessels actually are increasingly autonomous as well. So we're looking at all of these things very holistically. Offshore wind as well is another one. The offshore wind is not necessarily generated autonomously, of course, but the support vessels that provide the kind of maintenance services to those generators are increasingly autonomous. So we look at the cybersecurity of those as well, because of course that's critical national infrastructure. So it's a sort of vulnerable target. Next slide, please. So in terms of general research aims, I won't go through these in detail, but you can have a read. I'm sure these slides can be made available afterwards. And if anybody has any questions, my contact details will be up at the end. So feel free to ping me an email if you don't get your questions in on Slido now, or if I can't actually answer them, because I have to fess up at this point and say that I am not a technical cyber expert in any way. I just do the project management stuff. So these are our research aims. As you can see, we kind of cover the whole thing. It really spans from kind of real step one stuff to, really just understanding the scale of the problem, the types of problems that there are, right through to really targeted mitigation steps that we can take. So, for example, we think, we work very closely with insurers, with policymakers, with regulators, with government. We have a formal partnership in place actually with the Royal Navy, because they've got a lot of assets that they would like to ensure are cyber secure, of course. Anybody and everybody involved in the sector is represented, is involved, and we are open, of course, at all times to approaches, because we are happy to explore different ways of working collaboratively that could benefit and have an impact. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We are about 2 years into the project. I actually started this job 5 days before the first lockdown. So I did a total of 1 week in the office before I went into my spare room and was balancing the laptop on a box, for the next 12 months before I got my act together and Argos actually had any desks available to order. So as you can imagine, we kind of got held up at the beginning because we needed to build this facility. It's a tangible thing. But we're really proud of the fact that actually now we have the full setup. I'll show you a few pictures in a minute. I've got some slides coming up of what it actually looks like. We have different sets of ship's bridge devices, because the idea is that ultimately we'll be able to replicate any ship's bridge, and you'll be able to come in as the captain of anything from a small fishing vessel to a Maersk Triple E cargo carrier. You'll be able to say, right, I run this equipment. We'll say tap, tap, tap on our little touchscreen console, which our engineers are going to develop or are in the process of developing. And we'll say, right, brilliant, that's now what we're running in the lab. It's here, it's working. Then we test it for cyber vulnerabilities. And we can do that from a kind of basic set, an audio suite that we develop to up to really bespoke testing, depending, of course, on what people are, what they might need from our research. Again, we're always open to approaches from anybody within the sector who might have an interest in collaborating with us. If you happen to have any equipment that you think we could test in the lab, then do, of course, feel free to come and have a chat, and we're always up for those kinds of conversations. Next slide, please. So interestingly, and perhaps somewhat scarily, every single thing that we've looked at so far, we found a vulnerability in. I'm looking at Avanthica now because she is our chief pen tester. She's here in the room. And I think I'm right in saying that, aren't I? There is nothing that we've looked at that isn't vulnerable in some way. We've looked at specific attack scenarios. And I mentioned particularly the rudder system, because that one we have shown very tangibly. Our engineer has built a kind of scale model of the rudder system in the lab. And what we've discovered is that there's a standard set of switches that are used in almost every vessel's rudder system. And these switches have known embedded vulnerabilities due to the manufacturing processes. And actually, if you know that as a kind of bad actor in this scenario, it's not a huge leap of logic to imagine that once you're into the ship's bridge system, you can get into the rudder system and you can cause all sorts of problems. Obviously, if you think about a vessel on the high seas, finding you're not in control of the rudder is one thing. It's not great, but you're not necessarily near anything. You might not there might not be any kind of immediate danger. You'll probably be able to invoke your manual override protocols and get back in control with nothing too terrible happening. But of course, transpose that scenario to a kind of busy port entrance, for example. We've done some work modelling a scenario around entry to Valencia on a sort of sister project that we're running, which is EU funded, which looks specifically at the port side of things. So it marries nicely with what we're looking at on the vessel side of things. And that modelling has shown that if there were to be, for example, say a GPS triggered attack, so when your vessel reaches a certain set of coordinates, this attack manifests itself. And if those coordinates were to be up on entry to Valencia Harbour, and you happen to be in a big cargo carrier, for example, the kind of momentum wouldn't give you time. Even if you recognise what was happening immediately, there wouldn't be time to override what was happening to the rudder, and you could conceivably crash into the harbour wall or another vessel, or you might ground in shallow water. And then your port might be closed down for potentially weeks at a time, actually, if it's a really big vessel. So we're not in the market, obviously, of scaring people and finding these kind of disaster scenarios, but equally we are trying to educate people around the fact that they're not that far-fetched. They could happen, and they are a realistic probability. And of course, we would like to be in a position to do something about that before something happens. Next slide, please. Oh, a bit more technical information on some of the stuff we've done. I'm not even going to try and go through this stuff, but if you do have questions afterwards, we have our experts in the room, so feel free to use Slido to submit those. There's another slide, I think, after this, which, yes, here we are. So this is the one that I wanted to show you, because I'm sure you're wondering what this actually looks like. So here's some pictures from the lab. It is essentially a big room in the marine building down here at the bottom of campus. It's divided into two parts. We have the kind of forward-facing, more public side of the room where all of our researchers actually sit. We've got a kind of U-shaped console desk, which is meant to be reminiscent of a ship's bridge. where our kind of big screens and stuff are for communicating the messages that are kind of coming out of our research. And then in the back room, which we call the vault, is where all the equipment is, and you can see pictures of the equipment just there. I can hear you thinking, well, that doesn't look like a ship's bridge, and of course you're quite correct. It doesn't look like a ship's bridge, but it's not meant to. It is a ship's bridge, but we need to see the guts of it to really understand what's going on. And the main reason actually that I wanted to show these pictures was because a lot of people talk about digital twins in this kind of scenario, and they're very useful. There's a place for them, but we are not a digital twin, and we want to be very clear about that. We call ourselves a physical twin because we have the physical kit in a lab. It is a ship's bridge. The only difference is, of course, it's in a de-risked environment. We're not floating about on the water, so when we break it, it doesn't matter so much. And of course, it's on a secure network. So, well, it can be. We can connect and unconnect as we need to. But if there are nasty bugs in the system, which of course there quite often are, then we're sure that they're not going to run out into the public domain. One of the main reasons, though, that we use physical equipment is because actually sometimes cyber attacks manifest themselves in a physical way. So, for example, they could cause components to overheat, which could ultimately cause a spark and then, of course, a fire. And if you were using a digital twin, you wouldn't necessarily know that. So that's a good illustration, really, of why we're doing it the way we're doing it. Of course, as I mentioned, what we can then do is take that knowledge, put it in our ship's bridge simulator and simulate a fire at the right moment, at a realistic moment when we're trying to train our crews. Next slide, please. Going back to what I said at the beginning about this idea of a three-way partnership between government, academia, and industry. This slide I just wanted to show you really to kind of reinforce that and show you that really every aspect and every kind of facet of the sector is covered. So we talk to everybody from shipbuilders, component technology supply chain guys, through to the operators, both of the ports and the ships, classification agencies, the insurers, and of course the policy and regulatory organisations, the MCA and particularly DFT. At the moment, we're actually providing a report for the Department for Transport around the security of UK smart ports. And you can see on this slide just a little sentence for each about the real tangible benefits that we feel that we are able to provide them through our research. Next slide, please. This slide shows how we think the Cyber Ship Lab fits into the facilities that we have available more widely at the university and also within the Plymouth area. You can see the Cyber Ship Lab there in the middle in the kind of browny, dark orange, rusty colour box. I've mentioned the ship's bridge simulators, which we take the outputs from our research and we can use that to train the crews, the navigators of tomorrow. We also have in the green box on the left some cyber ranges here at the university, which allows us to craft and propagate our own malware. The idea being that, yes, of course, we're interested in the bugs and the glitches that exist in systems already, but we'd also, we want to throw our best academic brains at creating new stuff. In the idea being, of course, that we can, for a start, it's interesting, but also we can at least remain in step with, if not one step ahead of the guys on the other side of the fence who are also throwing their best brains at this, and hopefully at least have an idea of what might be coming down the line. Down on the right-hand side in the blue box, you can see a logo for something called Macra, which is a interesting kind of tangible spin out from our research that's been the product really of the last 2 years. It stands for Maritime Cyber Risk Assessment Framework, and it's a dynamic risk assessment framework that it has a particular use for insurers in the sector, because there have been historically some problems around insuring against a cyber attack in the maritime sector, which have led to people not wanting to necessarily divulge when they think they might have been subject to one, which of course kind of perpetuates the problem because then we don't know about it and we can't research it, and the same things happen over and over again. So one of the things we wanted to address was this problem about data sharing. So our academics have come up with MACRA, which is this, as I say, this dynamic risk assessment framework, which allows particularly insurers to calculate the cybersecurity risk of each vessel completely independently. And it takes into account things like, obviously, the cargo that you might be carrying, the route that you might be sailing, when and where your crew changes might take place. But really crucially for the Cyber Ship Lab, what it also takes into account is the outputs of our research, in that it can calculate if it knows what ship's bridge equipment a vessel is running, it can calculate using the known cyber vulnerabilities that we found. So that gives a kind of risk rating effectively. So that's a really exciting and important thing that's come out of the project already. In the kind of grey boxes on the left-hand side, I've mentioned the autonomous and the remote control side of things, which I've touched on. It's the way the industry's going, it's the way the sector's going. How quickly it gets there is another thing, but things are becoming increasingly autonomous, and we need to be sure that those operating systems are secure. We have, somewhat uniquely, I think, as a university, we have waterside facilities here in Plymouth. So we have actually our own slipway access to Plymouth Sound, which means that we're a really good test bed. We can do the theoretical research, of course, but we can also do practical testing. And so that goes back to the point I was making about being able to helpfully contribute to conversations around regulation, for example, in that space. And then lastly, the last thing I wanted to mention on this slide was Smart Sound Plymouth, which is the kind of wider stretch of water that you can see out the window down to the left. I believe actually it's the most heavily instrumented stretch of water in the world. We have a 5G mesh network above and below the water, and it goes out to about 20 nautical miles offshore. And so again, it allows us, really easy access to this amazing test bed right on our doorstep, which we can really use to further our research. Next slide, please. Last one, you'll be pleased to know. Just zooming out a little bit, really, onto sort of Plymouth University maritime more generally, just to kind of really put this in context. We focus obviously on the cyber side of things, but as a university, maritime in general is what we specialise in. It's what we're good at. It's kind of in our DNA, really. We're looking, as I mentioned, really closely at what the developments in offshore wind might mean, certainly from a cybersecurity point of view, but also more holistically. We've got a new DP simulator, which is a dynamic positioning simulator, coming very soon, which will allow us to do a lot more research in, as I say, to the kind of support that these offshore facilities might need. We have a growing fleet of marine autonomous assets. We are upgrading our control centre. And something we're really proud of is that we are leading on this ranking for SDG 14, which is life below water. We're actually number one for that. So maritime and cyber is our thing. Last slide, please. I think this is, yes, it's just my contact details. As I said, just in case anybody, because I've bombarded you with a whole load of information. I know Slido's there, but what often happens, of course, it happens to me all the time, is you come away and you kind of process this stuff and you think, oh, I wish I'd asked that. So if that happens to you, you've got my email address, ping me an email and I will either be able to answer myself or I'll find you someone clever who can. Thank you very much.